So we've looked at Theodore and Nestorius, and in the year 428, Nestorius becomes the Bishop of Constantinople. He was relatively unknown. He was a monk in Antioch, but he becomes Bishop of Constantinople in the year 428. And he arrives in the capital and he begins teaching the theology of his teacher, Theodore. And one of the things that happens that sparks the controversy is that one of Nestorius's associates preaches a sermon in which he denies that Mary should be called Theotokos. So this is the first time I've used the word Theotokos, or bearer of God, and so I need to talk about this for a little bit. In the 5th century, to call Mary Theotokos, do you know the word in Greek? Can I say it in Greek? Okay. Theotokos means bearer of God, or sometimes it's translated mother of God. But to call Mary Theotokos was not to make a statement about Mary. It was not designed to exalt Mary. Not at first. That came later. So there's a lot of Mariolatry in Roman Catholicism, in Eastern Orthodoxy, and in Ethiopian Orthodoxy, from what you tell me. That all came later. That's not what's happening now. When the theologians use the word Theotokos, what they are doing is emphasizing that the Son Mary bore is really God. That was the point. It was to make a statement about the Son. Nestorius opposed the idea of Theotokos at first. And instead, he said, if you want to use the word Theotokos, you should balance it by saying Anthropotokos, bearer of man. Bearer of God, bearer of man. And he proposed a new word, Christotokos, bearer of Christ. Now, one of the things to recognize about Nestorius is that when Nestorius used the word Christ, he wasn't talking about the Son of God who's become human. He's talking about the combination of the man and the Son. So Nestorius believed that there were certain words that applied only to the Son, and there were other words that applied only to the man. And then there were some words that applied to both of them. And Christ was the most important of the words that applied to both of them. So Nestorius could say Christ is God and Christ is man. But what he meant by that is the Logos is God, Jesus is man, and the word Christ refers to both of them together. It was a collective term, not a term for a single person, but a term for a single appearance. Remember that back at the beginning, this word prosopon had meant mask. Nestorius is basically using it that way, to mean mask or appearance. What you see when you see Jesus is the man. You never see the Logos. But Christ consists of the man plus the Logos, the man indwelt by the Logos. And so when you say that Christ is a single prosopon, what you mean is he's a single appearance, because you only see one of the persons. You never see the Logos. You just see the man. So notice, if we're just looking at terminology, Nestorius says Christ has two physes. We think that means natures. It seems fine. He says Christ is one prosopon. We think that means person. It seems fine. But he's not using either one of those words that way. He's using physis to mean person, two physes, the man and the Logos, one prosopon, one appearance, because you don't ever see them separately because you don't see the Logos. They appear as a single presentation. And Nestorius called that the prosopon of union. He said there are two hypostases and two prosopa, two persons, the man and the Logos, but they combine as a single prosopon of union, a single appearance, almost like a single mask. So what Nestorius is saying looks good only if you assume he's using the words the way we do. He's not. He's not using any of those words, except for ousia, the way we use them. Okay? So Nestorius' rejection of Theotokos was a rejection of the idea that Mary gave birth to the Son of God. The church's affirmation of Theotokos at this point had nothing to do with deifying Mary. That would come later, but at this point that's not what's happening. It is a way of saying her son is really God. Nestorius faced a lot of pressure to accept the title Theotokos, and eventually he did so only because Theodore had accepted it. But Theodore's reason for accepting Theotokos was simply to say that Christ is God because he is indwelt by God. And in that sense, you can say that Mary is Theotokos. In other words, he accepted the word while completely redefining it in a way that undermines the significance of it. So Theodore and Nestorius are effectively denying that the man Christ is God. The Logos is God. The man Christ is man. They are connected, and the word Christ applies to both of them. One more thing at this point. When Theodore and Nestorius interpreted the Creed, you would think that they would have a big problem with the phrase that says, who for us men and for our salvation came down. So here's the way they interpreted the Creed. Instead of saying that the first half of the second paragraph is about the Son and then the second half talks about him coming down, they say the first half of the paragraph is about the Logos and the second half is about the man. And they completely ignore the sentence, who for us men in our salvation came down. The centerpiece that holds the paragraph together, that holds the whole creed together. Nestorius ignores it altogether in his interpretation of the creed. Okay? This is a different picture of Nestorius than what you probably get. Sometimes people raise the question, was Nestorius really Nestorian? My answer, yes, and he was in fact worse than what you think Nestorianism consists of, in my opinion. That does not mean that the Church of the East later was Nestorian. I don't think they were. But Nestorius himself was even worse than what you think of as Nestorian, in my opinion. Okay? Shaki, you look like a question. No? Okay. I thought a question was arising there. Okay. So let's talk about the way Cyril responds to Nestorius. The first thing he does is to attack the idea of the two ages. Salvation is a restoration, not an ascent. We cannot ascend. God has to come down to us. He does that to restore us to the original beauty. Remember the quote I read earlier? The original beauty that human nature had before the fall. Salvation is God's giving us himself, not just giving us help or aid or cooperation. The Son comes to us in order to make us adopted sons and daughters, in order to grant us to share in his natural fellowship with the Father. He gives us himself by giving us a share in his relationship to the Father, not just cooperation in some human task. And since he emphasizes the downward motion of God so much, he emphasizes it was God the Son who suffered. Now let me talk about this for just a minute. There are two ways of thinking about this. One is to say, let's divide the man and the Logos. Only the man suffers. The Logos doesn't suffer. That's Nestorius' way. Another way of doing this is to say, the person who suffers is really God the Son. But he doesn't suffer as God. He suffers as man. He doesn't suffer in terms of his divinity. He suffers in terms of his humanity. He suffers in the flesh, in the humanity, as man. He doesn't suffer as God, as Word, in his divine nature. But nevertheless, the person who suffers is God the Son. For Nestorius, that's philosophically unacceptable. For Cyril, it is the heart of the gospel, that the Son of God had to come all the way down to the point of death on the cross. And that's what it took to free us from our sin and to bring us to God. Now, sometimes modern theologians, when they're talking about the crucifixion, will say, well, it wasn't the divine nature that suffered. It was the human nature. Who has heard that? Nobody. Good. Very good. I'm glad you haven't heard that. What have you heard instead?
When you say that suffered, does it include that died?
Yes. Yes. Then you have heard it was the divine. It was not the divine nature that died. It was the human nature. You have heard that. Okay. So let me talk about that for a minute. That statement is not wrong, but in my opinion, it is meaningless. Because natures don't do anything. Nothing happens to natures. Things happen to persons who possess natures. Persons who possess natures do things. God, in terms of his divine nature, is not capable of suffering and dying. But the Son of God, in terms of his human nature, is capable of suffering and dying. The person who died was the eternal Son of God. But he didn't die in terms of his divine nature. That's impossible. He died in terms of his human nature. Now, if you ask, well, how can the same person die in one way and not die in another way? I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. I think this may be the one moment in all of Christianity where our minds simply cannot grasp what's happening. We cannot understand how a person can die in this way, humanly, and not die in this way, be raised in this way, without ever having needed to be raised in this way, ascend to God in this way, without ever having needed to ascend or without ever having left his place at the right hand of the Father in this way. How that's possible, I don't think anybody knows. But Cyril's plea to us is, at that point, don't back away by saying something like, only the human nature died, which I think is a meaningless statement. Cyril's point is, at that point, say it anyway, even though you don't understand it. One of Cyril's favorite expressions is, let the mystery be adored in silence. But proclaim the human death of the Son of God for the sake of our salvation. With the qualifier, he died in terms of his humanity, not in terms of his divinity. But nevertheless, the person who died was the Son of God. One of the things that Cyril says in response to Nestorius, I mentioned this before, he says, the death of a man, a mere man, could not atone for our sin. The death of a mere man could not have accomplished anything. It has to be the death of a man who is more than a man in order to be effective for our salvation. Okay? So, it was really God the Son who suffered in his humanity. And one of the ways that we talk about this is to say that the subject in Christ is the Word. That's another way of saying who is the person. Not whether Christ is one person, but who is that person. That person is the same person he's always been, the Son of God. He is now human as well as divine. He now has two natures instead of one. He's now complex instead of simple. He's now clothed in flesh instead of, as the early church said, naked. Sometimes they spoke of the naked Logos before the incarnation, and the Logos clothed in humanity after the incarnation. But he's the same person he's always been. If that is not the case, then God did not come down for our salvation. Does everybody see how central this is, as Cyril is emphasizing this in opposition to Nestorius? Okay? One more way of thinking about this. If you want to talk about two natures, divine nature and human nature, the Son of God has always had the divine nature because he's the eternal Son of God. He's one of three persons who has always had the divine nature. The Father and the Spirit have also. And so he adds to himself a human nature at the incarnation, including a body, including a mind, a human soul, human emotions, everything. So that now the one person who had one nature has two natures. The one person who was simple is now complex. He's divine and human, rather than just divine. Sometimes Protestants think of the incarnation like, here's the divine nature, and it's united to this human nature that's created in Mary's womb, and instantly they're united to make a person. That's not what we're talking about. That would mean Jesus as a person began to exist in Mary's womb. Jesus as a person isn't eternal in that sense. But that's not what we mean. We mean Jesus as a person, the divine Son, has always existed. So he's been a person with one nature, and then at the moment of the incarnation, he becomes the same person, but with two natures rather than one. Does that help? Because sometimes we think about it like two natures are united to make a person, but that isn't what we mean. It's often what we say. But what we mean is the eternal Son of God had one nature before, and now he has two natures. Does that help in thinking about this? Okay? And so that eternal Son of God is the one who dies on the cross. But he dies in terms of that second nature. That humanity, that human nature, those are the same thing. You can say it either way. Not in terms of the divinity that he's already had, by which he is immortal. One of the characteristics of the Son as divine is that he's immortal. So he can't die in terms of his divinity. But he can die in terms of his humanity. Okay? Now, Cyril explains all of this with precision, which is very, very helpful. But Cyril also has one fundamental, what I consider to be exasperating ambiguity about the way he says things. And here it is right here. When we have the idea of the two elements of the one and unique Son and Lord Jesus Christ, okay, those elements are divinity and humanity. We speak of two natures being united. So there, he's using the word physis to mean nature. So he's drawing the line right there in that sentence. And that's all exactly like we did. But then read on. But after the union, the duality has been abolished, and we believe the Son's nature to be one, since he is one Son, yet become man and incarnate. All right, in that sentence, he is using the word physis to mean person. So he's drawing the line right there. In the same paragraph, he's speaking of two natures and of one nature in Christ. Okay? Now, how do I know that in the first case, The word physis means nature. I should have left physis untranslated here. We speak of two physes being united. Okay, how do I know that that is correctly translated nature there? I know because in the same sentence, he's talked about the elements, divinity, and humanity. So we know that physis means nature there because he's talking about divinity and humanity. So those are physes in the sense of natures. All right? But now, we believe the Son's nature to be one. Okay, that's the word physis again. That's the word physis again. But what does it mean there? It means person. How do I know? Because he says, since he is one Son. Do you see? In the first part of this sentence, physis refers to the elements, to divinity and humanity. So it means natures in our sense of the word. But in the second part of the sentence, physis there, the Son's physis, the Son's nature, means person because he's talking about one Son. So I can tell what he means, but this is exasperating use of words. And I've said so in print. I am a great fan of Cyril, but I have said in print, in writing, that this is exasperating. I've even used the word exasperating of exactly this passage. Okay? Though we affirm that the Word is God, on becoming incarnate and made man, any suspicion of change is to be repudiated entirely because he remained what he was, and we are to acknowledge the union as totally free from merger. Okay. Yes, Shaki.
I heard someone explain the Oriental Orthodox position, say two natures
Mm-hmm.
become one nature.
Right.
And that be what Cyril is reading.
That is certainly a way to interpret what Cyril is saying. And I need to come back to that. We're getting closer to that right there. And so what I'm going to be saying for the most of the rest of the time today will have to do with that. That is a way of interpreting this. You start with two natures, and then somehow they are changed into a hybrid third nature. That's what Western theologians think the Oriental Orthodox are saying. That may be what some Oriental Orthodox today are saying because they're clumsily repeating what Cyril was talking about. That's not what Cyril meant. It's not what Severus of Antioch meant. It's not what the early Oriental Orthodox meant. It is not what the Oriental Orthodox theologians who dialogue with the Chalcedonians mean today. It may very well be what some of the priests mean. But that's not what the high theologians have meant. And I'm getting to that. We're getting really close to exactly that issue. Okay? Yes, Abel.
What does the duality has been abolished here?
Okay. So that's what I need to explain next. So one of Cyril's favorite expressions is here. You see, we believe the Son's nature to be one, yet become man and incarnate. One of Cyril's favorite expressions is one incarnate physis of God the Logos, or one incarnate physis of the Logos. So that's normally translated one incarnate nature of the Logos. So that's one of Cyril's favorite expressions. Another one of Cyril's expressions is that Christ is out of two natures, out of two physis. So, Shaki, Abel, this gives the impression that he's talking about two natures coming together to become one nature. That's a natural way to read that. Okay, but another one of his favorite expressions is one out of both. And in the expression one out of both, the word one is masculine. The word physis in Greek is feminine. But in his expression, one out of both, the word one is masculine. One son out of both. One person out of both. Not so much one nature out of both. So here's what this is what the best interpreters of Cyril think Cyril is doing here. Cyril is not so much talking about two natures becoming one nature by fusing or something like that. He's talking about the fact that the two natures, divinity and humanity, are different realities, different elements. They're not the same as each other. Okay, we all agree on that. And yet, the one person after the incarnation is a single son, a single person. The fact that here, he says, since he is one son, and the fact that in the expression one out of both, the word one is masculine, both indicate that after the incarnation, he's thinking one son, one person. Before the incarnation, he's thinking two different realities. It is very unfortunate that he uses the word physis in both cases. That creates huge confusion for the church. But that's what I think he means. He's talking not so much about a process as he is about the fact that divinity and humanity are different realities, but the one person who is the one who is both divine and human after the incarnation is a single son, a single person. That's what I think he's doing. It would have been vastly better if he had used a different word there. And in fact, some cases where he says exactly the same thing, he does use the word hypostasis there. But not in a passage like this. So, what do we think of this? What I'm suggesting is that if you just look at the slogans, Cyril is ambiguous at best or misleading. If you step back and look at what he's actually saying, it becomes clearer what he's saying. And the people who interpret Cyril all say that it's very clear. So there's really not much disagreement about what Cyril is saying. He's saying the divine Son who has the divine nature adds the human nature. Now he has two natures, but he doesn't say it. He doesn't use nature consistently. So when he's thinking about divinity and humanity, he says one son from both. But sometimes instead of one son, he says one nature from both. When he's talking about divinity and humanity, sometimes he says from two natures. When he's talking about the Son as a whole, he says one Son or sometimes one nature. So he's clearly using the word physis two different ways and is not aware of the frustrating ambiguity. Okay? Can we agree with that, Amani? Here is maybe the crucial piece of information. Most of the Eastern Church, and especially the Egyptians, are committed not just to Cyril's ideas, but to his slogans, including one incarnate physis of the Logos, one incarnate physis of the Logos, including from two natures, two physes, including one out of both. Those are the three most famous slogans of Cyril. The Eastern Church, most of it actually, but especially the Egyptians, insists on those expressions, even though in those three expressions you have the word physis used two different ways. So they're not aware of a terminological problem, but they rally around those expressions. One out of both, from two physis, and one incarnate physis. The clearest of those is actually one out of both, because the word one is masculine. One person out of both realities. From two physis and one incarnate physis seem like they're contradicting each other. But the Egyptians insist, you shall follow Cyril, not just in his thought, but in his slogans as well. That is the line that they draw in the sand. You cannot pass that. You cannot go beyond that. You must do that. And that establishes the attitude of Oriental Orthodoxy. What some of the church does is to say, Cyril's thought is exactly scriptural. We like it. We want to affirm that. But you can't use physis two different ways. So we need to do something to standardize the way we use the word physis. So they say, one person made known into physis, and use the word physis only to mean nature. So Cyril is sometimes drawing the line here, as in one incarnate physis, and he's sometimes drawing the line here, as in out of two physis. The Oriental Orthodox basically want to keep that ambiguity. They don't recognize it as an ambiguity, but they want to keep the slogans. Chalcedon says, let's try to say the same thing while always drawing the line there and using the word physis to mean nature, never person. So Chalcedon, and we're going to get to this afternoon, but Chalcedon is affirming Cyril's thought very consciously in all the minutes of the Council of Chalcedon. Whenever anybody opposes Cyril, there is an outrage against them. They are always trying to follow Cyril. But they don't stick with his slogans because his slogans involve an inconsistent use of the word physis. And the Oriental Orthodox say, because you didn't stick with Cyril's slogans, you are Nestorian. And that's the problem. That's the disagreement between them in the 5th and the 6th century, which we'll go into more detail on. We're following there this afternoon. But does this make sense? Can you see the brilliance of Cyril's thought with this huge problem about inconsistent word usage? Western theologians are primarily looking at word usage, primarily looking at terms and slogans. They don't like Cyril. In that great big edition of the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers, there's no volume on Cyril because they didn't like him. But if you get past the slogans to his thought as a whole, virtually the whole church said, this is our preeminent Christological teacher. Let's either say exactly what he said, that's Oriental Orthodox, or let's say what he said while improving his use of words, and that's Chalcedon. Responses. Do you see what I'm getting at here? We haven't done the history. We're going to look at the Council of Ephesus, then the Council of Chalcedon, and then the aftermath of Chalcedon. But we've pretty much done all of the ideas now and the words. Does this make sense? Okay, as you're thinking about Oriental Orthodoxy, all of this is the background. Shaki, what happens when a priest says two natures were fused to be made into one nature? What's happening there is that they're following the slogans out of two physis and one incarnate physis. They're following the slogans while trying to remove ambiguity in word usage. They're assuming he's using the words consistently, which he isn't. And they're coming up with something, two natures fused together to make a third nature. That's an attempt to impose on Cyril a consistency in word usage that isn't there. What would be better would be to modify some of the slogans to be true to his thought, which is what I think Chalcedon has done. Okay? You'll see this more clearly as we put quotes from the Oriental Orthodox up on the screen this afternoon. Okay, shall we talk about what happens then? All right, here's another time when I put that slide up there, but we've been doing all of that from the paper. So let's talk about the Council of Ephesus. Nestorius becomes the bishop of Constantinople in 428, objects to the title Theotokos, so I've talked about that. Nestorius is condemned in the year 430 by a Roman synod. Cyril writes 12 anathemas in order to enforce the Roman condemnation of Nestorius. So these anathemas condemn things that Nestorius has said, and says to Nestorius, you must affirm these anathemas and therefore reject your own teaching, or you will be deposed. Nestorius persuades the emperor to call an ecumenical council in Constantinople, and the council is then moved to Ephesus. Now, what happens at the council is very complicated, and I'm not going to go into it very much, but basically it devolves into two competing councils. One led by Cyril with 200 bishops present, one led by John of Antioch and including Nestorius with about 45 bishops present. So if you look at who's at what council, it looks like the battle lines are drawn like this. Nestorius, John of Antioch, and Theodoret on one side, Cyril of Alexandria, and Pope Celestine on the other side. So it looks like a clash between equally represented schools. Remember, that's the way the books describe it to you. Antiochian school, Alexandrian school, they clash here at Ephesus. That's what it looks like if you look at who went with each council. But in reality, this is what it actually looked like. Basically, everybody's on one side theologically. Nestorius is on the other side. Theodoret is sort of sitting on the fence. So there's one, he could possibly go either way. But one of the most striking things about Ephesus is that John's council never defends Nestorius' Christology. You have these two councils. Cyril's council condemns Nestorius, and they explain why. John's council never defends Nestorius' Christology. It just criticizes Cyril's council for procedural irregularities. So when you dig deeply into the council, and when you look at the writings of all these people, as I have done, then you can see you don't have half the church over here and half the church over here. You have almost everybody over here. Nestorius is basically standing alone. And the people who seem to be siding with Nestorius are not so much in favor of him as they are angry at some of the mistakes that Cyril made from a procedural point of view. So it's really hard to summarize this because it's so complicated, but I'm trying to do this without getting too much into the details. The way this is often told is two sides, they clash, and then they're going to compromise in a formula of reunion 2 years later, which I'll talk about. But in reality, the formula of reunion is not so much a compromise as it is an expression of Cyril's Christology, but using the word physis to mean nature. Shaki? The irregularities?
Yeah.
Okay, so now I have to go into a little detail. So you have Cyril's group, Cyril and 50 bishops from Egypt. You have Nestorius's group, Nestorius and an armed military guard and 16 bishops from around Constantinople. And they are there in Ephesus. The papal representatives are late, and the large group from Syria is also late. So John of Antioch sends a letter to Cyril and says, I'm sorry, we're delayed. If we're delayed more than a week, start without us. Cyril reads the letter. Now, John surely meant if we're delayed more than another week. But Cyril took it at face value. Well, they were already more than a week late. So he started immediately and condemned Nestorius. And then John arrived and was furious that Cyril had started without him. And Cyril said, well, you said to start without me. But John was furious at Cyril. So that was the procedural irregularity that was the basis for John's counsel's complaint. So it's more detail than I meant to go into, but there you go. And then finally, still later, the papal representatives came. They looked over the situation. They agreed with Cyril's counsel. Then everybody started lobbying the emperor to say, we're the true council of Ephesus. And the emperor eventually sided with Cyril's council, which came to be called the Third Ecumenical Council. So that's a little more detail. You don't want any more than that. There's way more than that, but you don't want any more than that, okay? All right, now, so what came out of Ephesus looked like an impasse. And I want to emphasize that when your books describe it as two sides clashing, that's what it looks like here. That's what it looks like. But what happens after that is that the emperor sides with Cyril's council, Nestorius is exiled. Cyril and John realize their substantial agreement, and they work for a united statement called the Formula of Reunion. Now, in that Formula of Reunion exists in various different forms. We have 3 different versions of it. And the final version that is approved makes it crystal clear that the man, Jesus Christ, is the same person who was the Father's eternal Son. The fundamental point that Cyril and the church have been arguing for is crystal clear. And then after that, it speaks of a union of 2 physis. So it uses the word physis to mean nature. But it shows very, very clearly Jesus Christ is the Son of God who has become human. He is not a man indwelt by or separate from the Son of God. It's a clear rejection of Nestorianism, but it's also an improvement on Cyril's word usage because it uses the word physis one way to mean nature and speaks of 2 of them. So this is a very good statement that paves the way for the Chalcedonian definition. But remember those Egyptians, okay? Those Egyptians insisted on Cyril's slogans, not just Cyril's thought. So they look at the Formula of Reunion and they say, Cyril, how could you agree to this? You have sold out. You have rejected your own principles. You've allowed them to say 2 physes, even though you say 1 incarnate physis. So they start criticizing Cyril for agreeing to this. Cyril has understood, I'm interested in the substance of what it says. I don't care which way you use the word physis. I'm interested in what it says. But Cyril's followers are wedded just as much to his slogans as they are to his thought. So much so that they criticize him for compromising when he agreed with John of Antioch on this statement. Does that make sense? And this is where we begin to see the sentiment that's going to lead to Oriental Orthodoxy. In effect, Chalcedonians are using Cyril's ideas, but they're improving his word usage. Whereas Oriental Orthodox are using Cyril's ideas and insisting on his slogans even when Cyril himself did not insist on those slogans. The students are more wooden and less nuanced than the teacher. And so they insist on the slogans, not just on the substance of his thought. At a conceptual level, is this making sense? Okay, so you see what I mean in contrasting Cyril's and the church's view of Christ and salvation with that of Theodore and Nestorius. And also in partially contrasting Cyril's thought from the ambiguities of Cyril's slogans. And most of the church, almost the entire church, is affirming Cyril's thought. The Chalcedonians, we haven't got to Chalcedon yet, but the Chalcedonians are going to affirm the substance, but not the word usage. And the Oriental Orthodox are going to affirm the slogans, even though there's inconsistent word usage in 3 simple slogans. 2 of the slogans are inconsistent with one another in the way they use words. But they're going to affirm them anyway. Okay, so talk to me if you'd like. Reactions to this. Obviously, this is headed towards saying Oriental Orthodox Christology is the same as Cyrillian Chalcedonian Christology. But what do you think about this so far? I am trying to focus on the thought and do just enough with the word usage for you to understand what's happening. And I'm trying to leave as much of the politics out of it as possible, but the politics is also obscuring the agreement, as had been the case in the 4th century. Does this make sense? That's a hard question to answer. In the 6th and the 7th centuries, as the lines are hardening between the Oriental Orthodox and the Chalcedonians, the major theologians are going to become increasingly philosophical in insisting you have to say it our way. So for example, and we'll see this afternoon, the Oriental Orthodox are going to say where there is one hypostasis, there must be one physis. Where there are 2 hypostases, there must be 2 physis. So they're going to begin to say not that physis and hypostasis are synonyms, but that they have to go together. You have to have the same number of physis as you do hypostases. So they're going to begin to make fine distinctions between words that Cyril is using as synonyms, but to say they have to match up. Physis has to align with hypostasis. And on the other side, they're going to say physis cannot align with hypostasis. They have to be used differently. They're going to try to make physis and hypostasis into terms, which they are not here. And they're going to create a metaphysics to support either aligning them or distinguishing them. And I don't understand all of that very well. That's beyond my philosophical ability to understand. But that's what's happening in the 6th and the 7th century.
Philosophical.
Right, and yes, and that's widely agreed. But the human nature of Christ has a person. It has the person of the Son. The divine and the human natures both exist in the person of the Son.
But the human nature, before it's united to the divine nature that has a person.
Right, except that it didn't exist before it was united to the divine person. But you are getting at some of the things the Oriental Orthodox are talking about. You have to have the same number of physis as you have hypostasis. If you just have one hypostasis, you can only have one physis. That is part of this 6th and 7th century. See, what they're doing is they're creating a metaphysics to try to explain Cyril's thought and fix his terminology without admitting that his terminology was problematic, because they still want to maintain the slogans. Whereas Chalcedon is effectively acknowledging his terminology is problematic, let's do it differently. I'm going to show you the very moment when Chalcedon decided to switch to different terminology. It'll be this afternoon probably, but you're going to see in the most important quote maybe that I'll ever put up on the screen, you'll see it. You'll see it when it happens on the floor at the 4th session of the Council of Chalcedon. Okay? And by the way, for what it's worth, systematic theologians almost never read the acts of the councils. They look at the statements. They look at the concluding statements. So part of what I'm able to offer here grows out of an extensive reading of the really small details of the acts of the councils. Who's shouting at whom on the floor? Why are they shouting? Why are they upset? Yeah, why are the Egyptians saying, "You're a Nestorian, away with the Nestorians"? This is all written down. They said it on the floor, and it's all written down in the minutes of the council. It's really remarkable. But there aren't very many people who read all of them. Okay? What happens from here? After Cyril and John, Cyril of Alexandria, John of Antioch, come to agreement, they are mostly able to pacify the people who are accusing them of selling out and compromising. But then John dies in 441 and Cyril in 444. And from my perspective, if Cyril had lived another decade, he might have been able to be the equivalent of Athanasius in the 4th century. And he might have been able to help everybody at Chalcedon recognize you're saying the same thing. For lack of an Athanasius, the Oriental Orthodox and the Chalcedonians were not able to recognize their agreement. Cyril could have done it. Cyril didn't live long enough. Okay? So the extremists, and by extremists, what do I mean? Dioscorus was the bishop of Alexandria after Cyril died. Eutyches was a monk in Constantinople. And they were both extreme in the sense that they were wedded to Cyril's slogans, not just to his thought. So they were wedded to his slogans more than he was. And then on the other side, Flavian was the bishop of Constantinople. And Flavian believed that Nestorius had been condemned unjustly. In my opinion, he misunderstood Nestorius. And he understood Nestorius as if Nestorius meant two natures when he said two physis. But in fact, Nestorius meant two persons when he said two physis. So I think Flavian is giving too good an interpretation of Nestorius. And I think Dioscorus and Eutyches are too wedded to Cyril's problematic slogans, not to his thought. But anyway, they begin to oppose each other. And at a synod in Constantinople in the year 448, Eutyches is condemned. So question, who has heard of Eutyches? Okay? If you've heard of Eutyches, what is Eutyches described as saying? Does anybody know? Anybody know what Eutychianism as a heresy consists of? Okay, not quite. That what Eutyches is accused of saying is that the humanity of Christ is absorbed into his divinity like a drop of wine or honey into the sea and becomes basically lost. The idea of a hybrid is what later Oriental Orthodoxy is accused of saying. So they're very similar, but they're not quite the same. So Eutyches is accused of saying basically the humanity of Christ is lost. It was Nestorius' friend Theodoret who accused Eutyches of saying that. But when Eutyches was tried in the year 448, that issue never even came up. What Eutyches was criticized for in 448 was that he refused to affirm what is called the double consubstantiality, or the double homoousios. So the Creed had said that the Son is homoousios with the Father. One of the ways we translate that in English is consubstantial. By the 5th century, people were saying the Son is homoousios with the Father in terms of his divinity and homoousios with us in terms of his humanity. So that's called the double homoousios, or the double consubstantiality. And Eutyches objected to that. And so he was accused of denying the humanity of Christ. But at his trial, he said, I have never denied the humanity of Christ. And they say, well, why won't you affirm that he is homoousios with us? And he said, because the Creed doesn't say that. I'm trying to follow the Creed. The Creed doesn't say he's consubstantial with us, it just says he became human. So, in reality, Eutyches seems to be orthodox. He's just not expressing the humanity of Christ the way they want him to. And later on in the trial, they continue to pressure him, and he says, okay, if you think I need to say that, I will affirm that Christ is homoousios with us. And they condemn him anyway, because they say, coerced faith is not faith. So, if anybody was treated unfairly in all of this, it was Eutyches. Now, why is that significant? Because in the way the books often describe this, when I say the books, I'm talking about the modern theology books. I'm trying to explain why what's in your books is in your books, and why that doesn't do justice to what's happening. The way the books describe it, you have these equal and opposite heresies. Nestorianism on one side, Apollinarianism, Eutychianism, Monophysitism on the other side. Equal but opposite. The problem is one of emphasis. This is an overemphasis on the divinity to the point of not acknowledging his true humanity. This is an overemphasis on the humanity. Okay, that's the way the books often describe it, right? Yapstiga has said that's the way the books describe it. Okay, but when you look at the actual trial, there's nothing wrong with Eutyches. He's trying to follow the Creed. He's trying to follow the Bible. He's getting stuck on an affirmation that the Creed doesn't make, that Christ is homoousios with us. In the end, he says, okay, I'll make that affirmation. And they condemn him anyway. Eutyches has been treated unfairly. And that creates an uproar in the Eastern Church, not just in Egypt, but all over the Eastern Church. Everybody is furious that Eutyches has been treated unfairly. And he has been treated unfairly. Okay? So, then what happens? What happens next is that Flavian writes a letter to the Roman Pope, the Bishop of Rome, whose name is Leo, one of the most famous Roman popes, and he explains Eutyches' problem. And he describes Eutyches as having said, one out of both and out of two natures, which is true, that Eutyches followed Cyril's slogans. And so Flavian explains this to Eutyches, to Leo, as saying Eutyches believes that there were two natures before the incarnation, but one nature after the incarnation. And to Leo, that doesn't make any sense because the human nature didn't exist before the incarnation. So Leo writes this response, whose purpose is to show that there are two natures after the incarnation. And he says, in one point, it's just as wrong to say two natures before the incarnation as it is to say one nature after the incarnation. It's the other way around. Just divine before, divine and human after. Thinking in Latin, he's exactly right. But he doesn't even realize people are using the word nature, the word physis, differently. Flavian writes to him in Greek, it gets translated into Latin, and he has no idea that there's ambiguity about the word. So he thinks that what he needs to do is defend the two natures of Christ. When that gets translated back into Greek, it sounds like the two persons of Christ. Especially because in some places he makes it sound like the divinity and the humanity operate separately. And so back in the East, everybody thinks Leo's an historian. Leo, writing in Latin, acting on the basis of insufficient information, does the best he can. But when that comes back into Greek, everybody thinks Leo is an historian. Okay? Now, notice that the way the Western books describe this is Leo is the key to the whole thing. But Leo is actually not, this tome is not well received at all in the East. Here's the most famous of the statements that appears to make the two natures operate separately. Each form performs its own acts in cooperation with the other. That is, the Word doing what is proper to the Word, the flesh pursuing what pertains to the flesh. Okay, that sounds like the two natures act separately as two different persons, especially when you translate that back into Greek. Especially when you translate it back into Greek. So everybody gets upset about Leo's tome. Now, a little bit of a parenthesis here. When Leo realizes what an outrage there has been over his tome, he spends 10 years trying to clarify what he meant. And if you read all of that, which nobody does, but which I have, if you read all of that, then you see he's saying the same thing as Cyril. The one divine Son, the one person of the Son, has two natures after the incarnation. Even this statement here, when you look at the context of the sermon where he first said this, it looks much less suspicious than it does here. So what am I trying to get at here? I'm trying to suggest there's a consensus here that is being obscured by all kinds of misunderstanding. Eutyches has been treated unjustly. There's nothing wrong with Eutyches. Eutychianism is a heresy. If anybody really says that the humanity of Christ is absorbed into his divinity and lost, that's a heresy. I don't know of anybody in Christian history who's ever said that. But if they did, that would be a heresy. Eutyches didn't say that. Eutyches has been treated unfairly. And that has outraged the Eastern Church. So Pope Leo steps into the situation and makes it all worse because he's acting on the basis of insufficient information. He's writing in Latin. When it gets translated into Greek, it becomes extremely suspicious. So it looks like nobody agrees on anything when in fact everybody, except Nestorius, agrees on everything. Let me let that sink in for a minute. Do you see how that's possible? One of the things you keep hearing from me is there's a consensus even when we don't realize it. Do you see how that can be possible? Just as it was possible in the 4th century, it could be possible here. So I think we've got a situation here with Nestorius and not very many other people who are clearly heretical. And then you have a lot of people, all of whom are Cyrillian, but don't recognize the agreement with one another because of all of this miscommunication. Okay? So that's where we are in the summer of 449. So the next thing that has to happen is that we have to deal with the mistreatment of Eutyches. And so in August of 449, Dioscorus of Alexandria holds a synod in Ephesus. So the one in 448 and the one 449 are not ecumenical councils. So they're smaller councils. And the purpose of this is to review the condemnation of Eutyches and to reinstate him. It is at this point that the Greek translation of Leo's tome reaches Ephesus. And Dioscorus reads it, and he is so upset by it that he doesn't even read it out loud at the council. And in Greek, it would look really bad, as Josh recognized here. Okay? So, he refuses to read Leo's tome. Eutyches' condemnation is reversed, as it should have been, because Eutyches had been mistreated. Flavian is condemned, and in one of the worst moments in conciliar history, he is actually beaten and tortured so badly that he dies on his way home. This is probably the low point in the incivility of any council in church history. When Pope Leo hears about it, he brands this synod the robber synod. Not a real council, but a robber synod, mainly because they didn't read his tome. They didn't read his writing. But the emperor, Theodosius, supports the synod. Yes. The synods and councils were often very contentious. There was a lot of shouting. There was a lot of arguing. There may have been threats. The only other physical violence I've ever heard of is that there is a tradition that at the Council of Nicaea, St. Nicholas, you know St. Nicholas? Do you have Santa Claus in Ethiopia? Okay, none. Do you have Father Christmas? Something associated with Christmas? Okay, you don't have such a person? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, the real person behind American Santa Claus or English Father Christmas was a Turkish bishop named St. Nicholas. There's a tradition that at the Council of Nicaea, St. Nicholas slapped Arius for his heresy. That's the only other case of violence, and that's not very bad, that I've heard of. But this is awful. This is terrible. And so as a result of that council, a lot of those bishops at Chalcedon said that they were coerced into agreeing with Dioscorus. And that may have been true. They may have been coerced. Okay? Okay, so we have a council in 448, a council in 449, coming to opposite conclusions. A huge amount of misunderstanding. And yet I've suggested there's actually a consensus. The big problem preventing that consensus from coming to light at the moment is that the Emperor Theodosius is supporting the Synod in Ephesus, which is a dangerous political move because there was apparently coercion and violence at that Synod. So it seems like the impasse cannot be removed because Theodosius is supporting the Synod of 449 in Ephesus. But in what some people describe as a providential accident, Theodosius fell off of his horse in the year 450 and broke his neck and died. And he was replaced as emperor by a soldier named Marcian, who called an ecumenical council to meet in Chalcedon the next year. So after lunch, we're going to be ready to talk about Chalcedon. Let me just say one more thing. Marcion had a lot of ambition. And in particular, he wanted to be seen as a new Constantine. So what did Constantine do? He unified the empire, and he produced the Creed of Nicaea. Not really, but it was produced at a council that he called. And so Marcion wanted to unify the empire and produce a new creed that could have his name on it, that he could hold up and say, I am the new Constantine, look, here is my creed. So Marcion called the bishops to come together at Chalcedon, which happened in October of the year 451. And his command to them was, write a new creed. But the Council of Ephesus had said, you can't write another creed in opposition to Nicaea. So the bishops were not going to write a new creed, but Marcion was insisting on a new creed. And that's part of the background that we'll start taking up after lunch as we look at what happened at the Council of Chalcedon. Okay? So we have Chalcedon to go, and then the Oriental Orthodox reaction to it. So this afternoon we'll get further into the question of why the Egyptians and the Syrians opposed Chalcedon, even if they were saying the same thing according to me. And not just me. I'm not the only one who says that. Okay?